Your brother needs this money more than you. My mother said it while I was still holding the acceptance letter. The envelope from Westbridge University was open on the dining table, my name printed in bold at the top, the word congratulations still fresh enough to make my hands shake. I thought my parents would cry. I thought my dad would take a picture. I thought Caleb might even smile and say, "You did it, Maya." Instead, my father slid a folder across the table. "Not to me. To Caleb." Inside were bank statements, transfer forms, and the college fund papers my grandmother had promised were for my education. Caleb stared down at them in his stained grey hoodie, one hand already resting on the folder like he was afraid someone might take it back. Dad didn't look guilty. He looked finished. "You'll find another way," he said. For a second, I could only hear the refrigerator humming behind me. I looked at my mother. "What is this?" Mom folded her hands beside her plate. "It's a family decision." "A family decision," my voice came out smaller than I wanted, "about my college fund." Dad tapped the folder with 2 fingers. "Caleb is in trouble, real trouble. He needs a clean start." Caleb didn't lift his eyes. I stared at him, waiting for him to say no, waiting for him to push the papers back and tell them this was insane. But he only swallowed and whispered, "I'll pay it back someday." Someday. The same word he used after dropping out, after borrowing from Aunt Linda, after wrecking the second car Dad replaced before the insurance check even cleared. I set my acceptance letter on the table. Grandma said that money was mine. Dad's jaw tightened. Mom answered too fast. "Your grandmother wanted this family taken care of." "No," I said, "she wanted me to go to college." The room sharpened around that sentence. Dad closed the folder halfway, but not before I saw my name printed on one of the forms. And beneath it a signature. Almost mine. My stomach dropped. I reached for the paper. Dad snapped the folder shut. "That's enough," he said. I stood up slowly. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I folded the Westbridge letter, put it in my pocket, and walked out while my dinner sat untouched behind me. But one question followed me all the way to the front door. If the money was truly theirs to give away, why did the papers already have my signature on them? I slept in my car that night behind a 24-hour diner. Not because I had nowhere else in the world to go, but because going back to that house felt like walking back into a courtroom after the sentence had already been read. Every few minutes, headlights slid across my windshield. The diner sign flickered red over the dashboard. I kept my Westbridge acceptance letter tucked inside my jacket like it could still protect me from what had just happened. At 6:13 in the morning, my phone buzzed. "Mom." I stared at her name until the screen dimmed. Then the message appeared. "You really hurt your father last night. He was only trying to keep this family together. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." I laughed once, but there was no sound in it. I had lost my college fund. My parents had handed it to Caleb, and somehow I was the one making things ugly. By 8 I drove home because my laptop was still there, along with my school documents, clothes, and the notebooks I had filled with scholarship deadlines. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the front window. Caleb's game console was still visible through the curtains. His sneakers were still by the door. Nothing about the house looked like a place where someone had stolen a future the night before. When I walked in, the first thing I saw was Caleb's takeout container on the coffee table. The second thing I saw was my Westbridge envelope in the kitchen trash, half covered by coffee grounds. I pulled it out slowly. The corner was wet. Mom appeared in the hallway wearing her robe, her coffee mug in both hands. "Maya," she said like she was tired of me already, "don't start." I held up the envelope. "You threw this away." It was just the envelope. It had my name on it. She looked past me toward the living room. "Your father barely slept." "Good," I said. Her eyes snapped back to mine. "Excuse me." I walked toward my room. "I'm packing." She followed me down the hall. "You're being dramatic." I opened my closet and pulled my duffel bag from the top shelf. My hands were steady now, and that seemed to bother her more than if I had been crying. Mom stood in my doorway. You have always been the strong one, Caleb isn't like you. I shoved jeans into the bag. That's not my fault. He falls apart when people stop believing in him. I turned around. So he gets rewarded for falling apart and I get punished for holding myself together. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since the letter came, she didn't have a sentence ready. Then Dad's voice came from behind her. You're not being punished. He stepped into the hall fully dressed, belt on, keys clipped to his pocket, the same calm face he used when bills were paid late or Caleb needed another rescue. I looked at him. Then what do you call taking my college fund? I call it managing family resources. It was Grandma's money. It was under my management, he said. That doesn't make it yours. His eyes hardened. You're 18, Maya, you don't understand the pressure adults deal with. I grabbed my laptop from the desk. I understand Caleb makes a mess and everyone else pays for it. Dad took one step into my room. Watch your tone. There it was, the old rule. Caleb could fail, lie, disappear, borrow, crash, and come home with apologies that never turned into changes. But if I raised my voice, I became the problem. I zipped the duffel. What am I supposed to do about tuition? You have scholarships. Partial scholarships. Then community college is an option, Dad said. Lots of normal people do that. Normal peoples. As if Westbridge had been a childish fantasy, instead of the thing I had worked toward while Caleb slept until noon and called it stress. I said, Grandma told me that fund was for Westbridge. Dad's expression changed so quickly I almost missed it, not anger first, alarm. Then the anger came. Your grandmother trusted me to make adult decisions, he said, not you. Something cold moved through me. Because Grandma had never said that. She used to sit beside me at the kitchen table when I was 12 and say, Maya, this is your education fund, not because you owe us success, because you deserve choices. I remembered asking Dad about the balance when I was 16. Kids don't need to worry about money. I remembered asking again after Grandma died. Don't bring this up while your mother is grieving. I remembered him snapping the year before when I asked whether the account could cover housing. Do you think I'm stealing from you? At the time I had apologized. Now I wondered why that question had made him so angry before I had ever accused him of anything. Mom lowered her voice. Your brother needs stability. I looked around my bedroom. The scholarship calendar taped to the wall, the second-hand desk, the stack of college brochures I had collected like proof that leaving was possible. And I do. Neither of them answered. That was the answer. I picked up my duffel and pushed past them into the hall. Caleb was standing near the bathroom, hair messy, face pale. He looked like he had been listening the whole time. Dad said, Caleb, go downstairs. But Caleb didn't move. As I passed him, he whispered, Maya. I stopped. Dad's footsteps paused behind me. Caleb's eyes flicked toward our parents' bedroom, then back to me. His voice dropped so low I almost didn't hear it. I didn't ask for all of it. My fingers tightened around the duffel strap. All of what? He swallowed. Dad's voice cut through the hallway. Caleb. Caleb flinched like the word had hit him. I stared at my brother. For the first time he didn't look smug, he didn't look relieved, he looked scared. What does that mean? I asked. Caleb's mouth moved, but nothing came out. Dad stepped closer. Enough. The house went silent, except for the faint buzz of Caleb's game console, still running in the living room. I walked out with 2 bags, my laptop, and the sick feeling that my parents hadn't just chosen Caleb over me. They were hiding something. I threw my bags into the back seat and got into my car. My hands were on the wheel when Caleb rushed out barefoot, looking over his shoulder. I cracked the window. He shoved an old bank envelope through the gap. Don't tell Dad I gave you this. 4 months later, I was pouring coffee for a man in a Westbridge sweatshirt, while wearing my scholarship interview blazer over my cafe uniform. Extra cream, I asked. He nodded without looking up from his phone. I handed him the cup. wiped my hands on my apron, and glanced at the clock above the pastry case. 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, I had to cross campus, change out of the apron, and convince a scholarship panel that I was worth enough money to stay enrolled another semester. My life had become a schedule held together by panic and cheap black flats. Morning lectures, afternoon shifts, night assignments, weekend cleaning jobs when rent came due. I shared a room with a girl from my economics class and slept with earplugs because the apartment pipes clanked every night at 2. But I was at Westbridge. Not the way I had imagined. Not with my grandmother's fund. Not with my parents smiling in a photo outside the dorms. But I was there. The old bank envelope Caleb had shoved through my car window stayed hidden inside my accounting textbook. I had opened it only once, just enough to see Grandma's name, a faded bank logo, and the words Education Trust Summary across the top. Then I shut it again. Because if I looked too closely, I would have to do something. And I was barely surviving the things I already had to do. That afternoon, as I was tying my apron strings in the back room, my phone buzzed. A text from my cousin Lily. Please come to Mom and Dad's anniversary dinner tonight. Everyone keeps asking about you. I miss you. I stared at it. I had ignored every family gathering since the night I left. My mother had sent birthday messages that sounded like press releases. My father had sent nothing. Caleb had texted twice, both times deleting the message before I could respond. I typed back, I have work. Lily replied immediately. Just come late, please. I don't want the only story they hear to be theirs. That sentence sat in my chest through my interview, through the bus ride, through the walk to Aunt Linda's house in the cold with my blazer buttoned over a coffee stain. When I arrived, the dining room was already loud. Plates clinked, cousins laughed, someone had brought flowers, someone else had brought wine. It looked like family from the outside. Then I stepped into the doorway, and the sound thinned. Aunt Linda's smile froze for half a second before she hurried over. Maya, you came. Lily hugged me hard. Ignore everyone, she whispered. Across the room, Mom stood beside Caleb with one hand on his shoulder like he was the guest of honor. He wore a button-down shirt I had never seen before. His hair was combed. He looked cleaner but not calmer. Dad saw me last. His eyes moved over my thrifted blazer, my worn shoes, the tote bag digging into my shoulder. Then he looked away like he had expected worse, and was disappointed I hadn't given it to him. Dinner started with toasts. At first no one mentioned me. Uncle Mark talked about marriage, Aunt Linda cried, Lily squeezed my knee under the table whenever someone glanced in my direction. Then Mom lifted her glass. I also want to say how proud we are of Caleb, she said. Caleb's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Mom smiled at him. This year has not been easy, but he's turning his life around. Sometimes families have to make sacrifices to help someone get back on their feet. I felt Lily go still beside me. Dad added, and we're grateful for everyone who understood that we couldn't support every expensive dream at once. Every expensive dream. A few relatives looked at me. I set my fork down carefully. Mom continued, voice soft and polished. Maya had opportunities, she always did, but she chose to distance herself when things didn't go exactly her way. I pushed back my chair. Lily whispered, don't leave. But Uncle Mark spoke before I could stand. Maya, sweetheart, your parents did what they could. College is expensive, you can't punish them forever. I looked at him, is that what they told you? The table quieted. Dad leaned back in his chair. This isn't the place. No, Mom said with a small wounded laugh. Apparently every place is the place when Maya wants attention. My face went hot, but I kept my voice even. I didn't bring it up. You didn't have to, she said. You walked in here acting like we all owed you an apology. A cousin shifted uncomfortably. Someone set down a glass too hard. Then Mom said it. Loud enough for every person at the table. You always thought you were better than this family. I stood. Lily grabbed my wrist under the table, but I gently pulled away. I worked for something, I said. That's not the same as thinking I'm better. Dad's chair scraped the floor. His voice stayed calm, which somehow made it worse. "Maya, enough, you know very well you agreed to the arrangement." The room changed. Not loudly. No gasp, no dramatic reaction. Just a sharp, collective stillness. I turned toward him. "What arrangement?" Dad folded his hands in front of his plate. "You signed paperwork acknowledging that the fund could be redirected because of your scholarships." For a second, I wasn't in Aunt Linda's dining room anymore. I was back at our table, watching Dad close the folder before I could touch the page with my almost signature. "You're lying," I said. Mom closed her eyes like I had embarrassed her. "Maya." Dad's mouth tightened. "Be careful." "No," I said, "show it." His eyes narrowed. "Show everyone the paper I supposedly signed. That is private financial documentation. You just used it in front of the whole family." Uncle Mark looked between us. Aunt Linda's hand hovered over her napkin. Lily stared at Dad like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Dad smiled, but nothing in his face warmed. "You're upset, I understand, but rewriting history won't change what happened." My tote bag was still hanging on the back of my chair. Inside it was my accounting textbook. Inside that was Caleb's envelope. I pulled it out before I could lose my nerve. Caleb's head snapped up. Dad saw the envelope and went completely still. I opened it with fingers that did not feel like mine, and unfolded the photocopy I had been too afraid to read. Grandma's name. My name. Education Trust. Restricted for Maya Ellis until age 22. The words blurred for half a second, then sharpened. I looked at Dad. "This says it was restricted." Mom's face drained. Dad stood. "Where did you get that?" I looked at Caleb. So did everyone else. Caleb's shoulders hunched, sweat shone at his hairline. Dad's voice dropped. "Caleb." Caleb gripped the edge of the table. "I didn't think she'd bring it here." Dad moved one step toward him. And then Caleb broke. "Dad, stop," he said, loud enough for the whole room. "She didn't sign it." The silence hit harder than shouting. Mom's fork slipped from her hand and clattered against her plate. Aunt Linda covered her mouth. I looked at my brother, but he was staring only at Dad. For once, Caleb had said something he couldn't take back. Dad's expression barely changed, but his hand closed around his water glass so tightly his knuckles whitened. He leaned toward Caleb and said, "One more word and you lose more than she did." 3 years and 8 months later, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor of a building my 18-year-old self would have been afraid to enter. A spreadsheet was open on the screen in front of me. My nameplate sat beside the keyboard. Maya Ellis, Financial Compliance Associate. The words still looked strange sometimes. Not because I hadn't earned them. Because every inch of that title had cost me something. I had finished Westbridge with scholarship appeals, federal loans, summer credits and shifts that left my feet numb by midnight. I learned how to smile through interviews after sleeping 4 hours. I learned which vending machines on campus gave extra crackers if you hit the button twice. I learned that pride was useless when rent was due, but dignity was not. And somewhere between auditing student organizations and reading trust law under fluorescent library lights, I had made myself a promise. No one would ever use paperwork to make me powerless again. That morning, my manager, Priya, stepped into the conference room holding a thin blue file. "New nonprofit review," she said. "Small community foundation, mostly routine, but there are reimbursement issues and old account transfers we need cleaned up." She set the file in front of me. I opened it. The first page was ordinary: entity name, tax ID, reporting period, assigned contacts. Then I saw the volunteer treasurer's name. Robert Ellis. My fingers stopped moving. Priya noticed. Problem. I kept my face still, but the room seemed to narrow around the page. "That's my father," I said. Priya's expression changed immediately. "Then we'll reassign it." She reached for the file, but I held up one hand. "Let me check something first. I'll file the conflict disclosure either way." Priya studied me for a moment. Professionally. Professionally, I said. She nodded once and stayed by the door while I turned the next page. The foundation was connected to my hometown. That part wasn't surprising. My father had always liked positions where people called him dependable: treasurer, committee chair, the man with the checkbook and the calm voice. But then I saw the bank name attached to a set of supporting documents. The same bank logo from Caleb's envelope. My throat tightened. I clicked into the archived scans. Reimbursement forms, transfer authorizations, old statements, nothing dramatic at first, just numbers arranged neatly enough to look harmless. Then I saw the notary stamp. My body recognized it before my brain finished reading. A round seal, a smudged date, a name I remembered from my father's barbecues. Glenn Marrow. Dad's friend. The same name sat on the photocopied trust summary I had kept hidden for nearly 4 years. I leaned closer to the screen. There were signatures on the non-profit forms that looked careful, too careful. The letters had a stiffness to them, like someone had practiced being natural. I thought of the paper Dad had snapped shut at the dining room table. My printed name. The almost right signature. Priya's voice came from the doorway. Maya. I exhaled slowly. I need to disclose this now. She stepped inside and closed the door. What did you find? Maybe nothing, I said, but my hand was already moving to open the internal reporting portal. Maybe a pattern. I filled out the conflict form with every relevant connection. Father, prior family financial dispute, potential overlap with trust documentation, possible notary concern. I didn't write revenge. I didn't write theft. I wrote facts. Because facts were harder to bury. After Priya reassigned the non-profit file to another team, she allowed me to preserve the documents I had already accessed under internal procedure. I copied nothing to myself. I emailed nothing home. I followed every rule with almost painful precision. Then, on my lunch break, I took out the envelope Caleb had given me 4 years earlier. It had travelled with me through 2 apartments, 3 campus jobs and graduation. The edges were soft now. The paper inside was creased along the same lines from being unfolded and hidden too many times. At the bottom of the trust summary was an attorney's name. Marion Voss. I had seen it before, but I had never called. At 18, I was too scared. At 19, too broke. At 20, too exhausted. At 21, too busy convincing myself that surviving was enough. But now I was 22. And according to the document in my hand, that mattered. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. Voss and Klein, a receptionist, answered. My name is Maya Ellis, I said. I'm calling about an education trust established by my grandmother. There was a pause, keyboard clicks, a transfer. Then an older woman's voice came on the line. This is Marion Voss. I sat straighter. Ms. Voss, I think my father submitted documents regarding that trust when I was 18. Another pause. This one was different. Yes, she said carefully. There were release documents submitted. My pulse pressed against my ears. Did those documents include my signature? They included an acknowledgement under your name, she said. May I ask why you're requesting this now? I looked through the conference room glass at the city beyond it. Cars moved below like none of this mattered to anyone but me. Because I didn't sign anything. Marion Voss did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice had lost its softness. Ms. Ellis, I think you should request the full file. I'm legally allowed to do that. You are now. The full file arrived 2 days later through secure delivery. I opened it in a small meeting room with Priya present as witness, my own independent attorney already looped in after a short consultation. The first document was Grandma's trust agreement. There it was in plain language. Funds restricted for the post-secondary education of Maya Ellis until age 22. Not family use. Not emergency support. Not Caleb's debts. Mine. The second document was a release acknowledgement dated 1 week after my Westbridge acceptance letter. My name was typed under the signature line, and beneath it was the handwriting I had seen for half a second 4 years before. Almost mined, but not mined. My attorney, Mr. Harlow, was on speakerphone. Maya, look at the witness and notary section. I scrolled down. Robert Ellis, trustee authorization. Glenn Marrow, notary public. My stomach turned cold. Priya said quietly, there's your overlap. But there was more. Attached to the release was a ledger showing 2 transfers before the final fund closure. One large payment had gone to an escrow account. The reference line made my fingers go still. Caleb Ellis / Brightpath Systems, Civil Demand Resolution. Brightpath Systems. Caleb's startup. The one my parents had called a misunderstanding. The one he stopped talking about after suddenly turning his life around. The one that had somehow disappeared right before my college fund did. I clicked the archived demand letter. A group of early investors had threatened to sue Caleb for misrepresented expenses and missing funds. The settlement amount was almost exactly what had vanished from my grandmother's trust. I sat back. For 4 years I had thought my parents gave my money to my brother because they loved him more. That had been true. But it had not been all. They had used my future to clean up his fraud accusation, then created paperwork to make it look like I had agreed. Mr. Harlow's voice came through the speaker. Do not contact your parents directly, preserve everything. We'll send formal notice after I review the full file. I already filed an internal conflict disclosure, I said. Good, keep everything clean. Clean. That word almost made me laugh. Because my father had built the lie assuming I would always be too emotional, too young, too dependent, or too ashamed to challenge him. Instead, he had pushed me into the exact field that knew how to read what he hid. By Friday afternoon, the evidence had been preserved through my firm's channels, the non-profit review had been fully separated from me, and my attorney had copies of the trust documents, the forged release, and the notary records. I was at my desk updating a case memo when the receptionist called. Maya, she said, there are 3 people in the lobby asking for you. I glanced at the clock. Clients. Not exactly, they asked for Ms. Ellis. My fingers paused above the keyboard. Through the glass wall beyond my desk, I could see the reception area. Mom stood near the front desk clutching her purse with both hands, her shoulders tight under a cream cardigan. Dad stood beside her in a dark jacket, staring at the firm logo mounted behind reception like it had personally offended him. And behind them was Caleb. Pale, silent, older than I remembered. I rose slowly. For 4 years they had controlled the room. The dining table, my bedroom doorway, Aunt Linda's anniversary dinner. But now they were standing in my office, beneath my firm's cameras, inside a building where documents mattered more than Dad's tone. Priya appeared beside me. Do you want security? I looked at the open file on my desk. Trust agreement. Forged acknowledgement. Notary seal. Transfer record. No, I said, not yet. I stepped toward the glass door. Before I could open it, Dad turned his head. His eyes landed on the file spread across my desk. The color drained from his face. He froze. I opened the glass door before my father could look away. For once he didn't speak first. Mom turned at the sound of the door and tried to smile, but it collapsed almost immediately. Her eyes moved over my blazer, my badge, the conference rooms behind me, the people walking past with folders and tablets. Maya, she said, stepping forward with her arms half open. I stepped back. Her hands froze in the air, then dropped to her purse. Dad cleared his throat, that old sound, the one that used to make everyone in our house straighten up and prepare to be corrected. We need to talk, he said. I looked at Caleb, he wouldn't meet my eyes. Dad continued, there's been a misunderstanding, and if we handle it now, we can keep it from damaging the family. The family. 4 years later, he was still trying to make the crime sound like a weather event that had happened to all of us equally. I held the door open wider. Conference room. Mom blinked. Can't we go somewhere private? This is private enough. Dad's jaw shifted, but he walked in. Mom followed, gripping her purse like a shield. Caleb came last and closed the door behind him without being asked. The room had one long table, 6 chairs, a wall-mounted screen and glass on 2 sides. Not a dining room, not my bedroom doorway, not Aunt Linda's table where everyone could be managed with tone and shame. Dad sat at the head of the table out of habit. I sat across from him. Then I placed my phone in the center of the table and tapped the screen. A calm male voice came through. "This is Daniel Harlow. I'm Maya's attorney. I'm on the line." Dad's face changed. Not much, but enough. His shoulders lowered by half an inch, like some invisible frame had cracked under him. Mom whispered, "Attorney." I opened the files. The first page was my grandmother's trust agreement. "Grandma created an education trust for me," I said. "Not a family emergency account, not Caleb's rescue fund, not money Dad could move around because he felt like it." Dad leaned back. "You're oversimplifying." "No," Mr. Harlow said through the phone. "She's not." Dad's eyes snapped to the phone. I slid a copy of the trust agreement across the table. Dad didn't touch it. So I slid the next page. The trust restricted the money for my post-secondary education until I turned 22. You were managing it as trustee. Mom stared at the paper. "Robert." Dad didn't look at her. "Denise, don't." That was the first crack. Not denials. Control. I turned to the next document. 1 week after my Westbridge acceptance letter arrived, a release acknowledgement was submitted under my name. I placed that page in front of them. Mom's eyes dropped to the signature. Her face went slack. Caleb made a small sound, barely more than breath. I looked at my father. "I didn't sign that." Dad folded his arms. "You understood what we had to do." "I didn't even know that document existed." "You were 18, he said. "You were emotional, you don't remember every conversation." I almost smiled. Not because anything was funny. Because even with the paper on the table, he still thought certainty could be bullied into becoming truth. "I remember the dining room," I said. "I remember you sliding the folder to Caleb. I remember asking if Grandma's money was mine. I remember you shutting that folder when I reached for the signature." Mom closed her eyes. Mr. Harlow spoke again. "Mr. Ellis, the issue is not memory. The issue is that the signature does not match Maya's verified signatures from that period, and the notary record is being challenged." Dad's face hardened. "That's absurd." I placed the notary page down next. "Glenn Marrow," I said, "your friend." Caleb looked up for the first time. Dad's hand moved slightly toward the paper, then stopped. I kept going. Before the final release, part of the fund was transferred to an escrow account connected to BrightPath Systems. Caleb flinched at the name. Mom turned toward him. "Caleb." He swallowed. "Mom." I set down the demand letter. "BrightPath Systems received a civil demand from early investors," I said. "They accused Caleb of misrepresenting expenses and missing funds. The settlement amount was almost exactly what disappeared from my trust." The room went completely still. Not the stunned silence from Aunt Linda's dinner. This was different. This silence had nowhere to run. Mom's lips parted as she read the page. "Robert, you told me his business partners were threatening him over a loan." Dad's voice came out low. "That's what it was." "No," Caleb said. Dad turned slowly toward him. Caleb's face was pale, but his voice didn't disappear this time. "No, it was. I told you they were going to sue. I told you I'd messed up the expense reports. You said you could make it go away." Mom gripped the edge of the table. "You knew." Caleb's eyes were wet. "After I knew after." I looked at her, "And you knew after too." Mom stared at me. "You helped cover it," I said. "You told everyone I left because I was spoiled. You told Aunt Linda I wanted an expensive fantasy. You told people I signed paperwork so they'd blame me before I could ask questions." Her face crumpled. Not gently. It was ugly and frightened. Her mouth trembled, and she pressed her fingers against it like she could hold the sound in. I thought, she started. I waited. She couldn't finish. Dad did it for her. We thought we were protecting Caleb. I looked at him. You protected Caleb with money my dead grandmother left for me. Then you forged my name so it looked like I gave you permission. His fist hit the table once. Mom jumped. This is still your family, he snapped. You would destroy your own father over money. There he was. The man from the dining room. The man from my bedroom doorway. The man from Aunt Linda's anniversary dinner. Still reaching for the biggest word in the room and trying to make it obey him. I leaned forward. No, I said. You destroyed this family when you stole from a dead woman's promise and made your daughter apologize for being robbed. Caleb lowered his head into his hands. Mom began to cry harder, but I did not move to comfort her. For years, her tears had been used as doors I was expected to walk through. This time I stayed seated. Mr. Harlow's voice filled the space between us. Formal notice will be delivered by end of day. The trust violation will trigger a civil claim for the misappropriated funds, interest and fees. The forged acknowledgement and related notarization will be reported to the appropriate authorities. Mr. Ellis, given your current role as treasurer for the foundation under review, you should retain counsel immediately. Dad stared at the phone. For the first time in my life, he looked like a man hearing rules from someone he couldn't intimidate. Mom whispered, Robert, what does that mean? He didn't answer. Because we all knew what it meant. It meant the paperwork he used to corner me had become the evidence cornering him. The weeks after that meeting did not unfold like a movie. There was no dramatic arrest in front of neighbors, no screaming confession on a courthouse step. It was slower than that. Cleaner. Worse for them. Dad resigned from the non-profit before the audit findings became public, but the resignation only made people ask why. The foundation board reviewed every reimbursement tied to his name. Glenn Marrow, the notary who had stamped the release, lost his commission after the complaint was investigated. Caleb's old Brightpath settlement was reopened in civil court once the source of payment came under dispute. He entered a repayment plan and sent me a letter on plain white paper with no excuses. I didn't read it for 3 days. When I finally did, it was short. I knew it was wrong. I was scared. I let you pay for what I did. I'm sorry. It didn't fix anything. But for the first time, Caleb had written a sentence that didn't hide behind Mom or Dad. The family story changed faster than I expected. Aunt Linda called me one evening while I was eating takeout over my kitchen sink. Her voice broke before she said my name. I let them humiliate you at my table, she said. I didn't make it easier for her. I said, yes, you did. She cried quietly for a moment, then said, I'm sorry. Cousins stopped inviting Dad to birthdays. Uncle Mark, who had cornered me about gratitude, sent one stiff apology text and then avoided me completely. Mom lost the version of herself she had built in front of everyone, the devoted mother holding a difficult family together. The documents moved through the family like a cold wind. No one could pretend they had misunderstood after seeing my forged signature beside my grandmother's trust. Financially, the case ended in a negotiated judgment. Dad had to repay the stolen trust amount, interest, and legal fees. It didn't give me back the nights I slept in my car. It didn't erase the coffee shifts, the skipped meals, the loans I signed with shaking hands, or the 4 years I spent learning how to survive without the safety net Grandma had already given me. But it cleared my debt. And for the first time in my adult life, the money in my account belonged to me without guilt attached to it. Dad signed the repayment agreement under supervision. I watched him do it from across a polished conference table, the same way he had once watched me stand in our dining room with my future folded in my pocket. This time, he was the one reading papers he couldn't control. Mom asked me afterward if we could start healing. She said it in the parking lot, standing beside Dad's car while he looked straight ahead through the windshield. I asked her, do you mean healing or do you mean going back? She hugged her cardigan tighter around herself. I had my answer. I kept limited contact with Caleb after he accepted responsibility and began making payments. We weren't close. We didn't pretend 4 years of silence could be repaired with one apology. But when he spoke to me, he spoke without Dad's shadow standing behind him. With my parents, I chose distance. No holiday dinners where everyone acted careful around the truth. No Sunday calls where Mom cried until I softened. No private meetings where Dad could lower his voice and rewrite the room. They had trained me to fear being selfish. But what they called selfish was simply the moment I stopped being useful to people who hurt me. I stayed at the firm for another year, then moved into trust compliance full-time. The work suited me: restricted funds, fiduciary duties, signatures, records, promises written clearly enough that no one could pretend they meant something else. In my office, I framed my Westbridge acceptance letter. The original one. The corner was still faintly stained from the coffee grounds after Mom threw the envelope in the trash. I kept it that way. Not because I wanted to remember the pain. Because I wanted to remember the exact day I stopped begging people to value me. 4 years after they told me I would find another way, I did. And this time they were the ones with no way out.